When historians talk about Tennessee back in 1845, they typically focus on the obvious stuff: westward expansion, booming agriculture, and America's frontier pushing outward. But the real story, the one that barely made it into newspapers and still hides in dusty archives, happened underground. And it all started with something as simple as needing a well. A crew of workers got their orders to dig a well on William Shumet's land, a property owner out in White County, Tennessee. The job was basic: break through the dirt, hit groundwater, and give the farm a dependable water source. But the moment those workers started digging, something unexpected happened. They broke through layers that had been untouched for centuries. At 50 feet down, way deeper than any normal well would go, the team hit bones that didn't match any human remains on record. The way they were positioned was strange. The depth was extraordinary, and the skeletal structure looked like nothing documented in any anatomy book. The measurements made no sense. The proportions were unsettling, and the sheer size of what they pulled from that hole would shake everything the scientific establishment thought it knew about human history. This discovery never made it into official statements, and it didn't stay in the newspapers for long. But scattered throughout that year's documentation, one specific phrase keeps showing up: giant skeleton, unprecedented size, deeper than expected. The official story would eventually write all of this off as exaggeration, misidentified animal bones, or just frontier folklore. Nothing special, nothing worth serious consideration. However, the newspaper reports from that time, the ones published while the discovery was still fresh, tell a different story. They describe workers standing next to bones so massive that full-grown men looked like children in comparison. A skeleton supposedly measuring 18 to 20 feet long, with a skull big enough to fit over a man's head like a helmet. A skeletal structure so heavy that multiple sources claimed it weighed 1,500 pounds. And here's the most disturbing part: this wasn't an isolated find. Throughout the 1800s, similar discoveries kept popping up across Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and neighboring regions. Giants found in burial mounds, giants uncovered during construction work, giants revealed during farm excavations. Different places, different situations, but the same impossible measurements, the same unusual depth, the same silence that followed. When William Shumet's workers pushed past those first layers of Tennessee soil, their expectations were straightforward. They figured they'd hit bedrock, maybe some rocks, and eventually water. Nothing weird, nothing out of the ordinary. But at 50 feet below the surface, those assumptions fell apart. Because instead of reaching the water table, the crew discovered skeletal remains that didn't work the way human anatomy is supposed to work. The first thing that stood out was the proportion. Every bone, femur, radius, skull, ribs, seemed to follow human structure, but at a scale that defied medical understanding. The skeleton wasn't just tall, it was architecturally different, built for a body that would have stood between 18 and 20 feet tall when alive. Measurements that, according to every accepted principle of human biology, can't exist. Yet these workers weren't looking at folklore. They were standing in a 50-foot hole surrounded by physical evidence. Bones that took several men to lift, a skull so enormous that witnesses described putting it over their own heads, teeth the size of a man's thumb, ribs thick enough to pass for fence posts. Then came the decision that turned this from a curious find into a documented phenomenon. The skeleton was put on public display for weeks, possibly months. The remains were exhibited in a theater, and people paid admission to see what newspapers were calling the Tennessee Giant. Descriptions ran in multiple publications. Measurements were recorded, and witnesses gave their testimonies. This wasn't some rumor spreading through backwoods communities. It was a public spectacle, documented in the press and seen by hundreds, maybe thousands of people. The skeleton existed, the measurements were on record, and the evidence was undeniable. At first, the scientific community tried to classify the discovery in the simplest way possible. Unusual genetic anomaly, misidentified mastodon remains, exaggerated frontier tale. But as documentation piled up and more giant discoveries surfaced across the region, the contradictions multiplied. Why were these skeletal remains consistently found at depths far beyond typical burial practices? Why did the bone structure maintain human proportions despite impossible dimensions? Why were similar discoveries emerging across multiple states in locations hundreds of miles apart, yet sharing identical characteristics? And the thing that bothered even the most conventional anatomists: why were these remains so structurally complete? Giant skeletons weren't fragments or scattered bones. They were intact skeletal systems positioned as if deliberately buried, discovered in locations that suggested intentional burial rather than random fossilization. Survey documentation from the 1840s shows this clearly. Multiple newspaper accounts describing identical findings, workers standing beside bones that shouldn't exist according to established science, measurements that defied biological possibility yet kept appearing in independent reports. But the most troubling detail wasn't what showed up in the newspapers. It was what didn't show up in the archives afterward. The official scientific reports written in the years following these discoveries barely mention these findings. Some illustrations leave out the measurements entirely, and certain accounts get condensed with vague terminology like quote 0 or quote 1, even though the original reports showed they were far more extraordinary than that. The silence is hard to ignore, because if these giant remains genuinely belonged to recognized human populations, why weren't they preserved in museums? Why weren't the exceptional anatomical characteristics thoroughly recorded in scientific journals? Why were the skeletal remains scattered, hidden, or just vanished from public view? Even specific bone measurements presented a problem. Proportions too consistent across multiple discoveries. Burial depths too uniform for coincidence. Skeletal preservation too complete for random geological processes. Evidence that looked less like evolutionary anomalies and more like an entirely different human population. A population that, according to the conventional timeline, never existed. When you track what happened to the Tennessee giant after its public display, something becomes impossible to ignore. The skeleton didn't just return to private ownership, it vanished. Not gradually, not through natural deterioration. It disappeared. The public exhibition stopped abruptly. The skeletal remains were pulled from display, and within a remarkably short time, the physical evidence that had drawn crowds and generated newspaper coverage simply ceased to exist in any documented location. The official explanation: the skeleton was too fragile for continued display, or it was returned to the Shumet family, or it deteriorated due to improper preservation. But none of these explanations account for the completeness of the disappearance. Not a single bone preserved in a museum, not a single fragment kept for scientific study, not even photographic documentation from the public exhibitions. For a discovery that generated such public interest, that was documented in multiple newspaper accounts, that was observed by hundreds of witnesses, the physical evidence vanished with suspicious thoroughness. And this is where the Tennessee discovery transforms from an isolated curiosity into evidence of something more systematic, because the 1845 giant wasn't unique. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Giant skeletal discoveries kept emerging across North America. Federal institutions received numerous giant remains. Newspapers documented discoveries in burial mounds throughout the Ohio Valley, and archaeological expeditions unearthed oversized skeletal structures in locations spanning from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Different decades, different locations, yet the same impossible measurements, the same subsequent disappearance. Official correspondence from government repositories acknowledges receiving these remains, and internal documentation references giant skeletal acquisitions. Yet when researchers try to locate these specimens in modern collections, they find nothing. The bones have vanished, the documentation has been minimized, and the physical evidence has been systematically removed from public access. The further researchers dig, the stranger the pattern becomes. Giant discoveries weren't random. They emerged from specific contexts. Ancient burial mounds, earthwork constructions, deliberate burials positioned at extraordinary depths. These weren't accidental fossilizations. They were intentional burials, suggesting a culture that understood ritual, possessed organizational capability, and constructed monuments that still exist across the American landscape. Mounds that mainstream archaeology attributes to Native American cultures, yet which contain skeletal remains that don't match documented tribal populations. The mounds themselves present additional mysteries, constructed with geometric precision, aligned with astronomical phenomena, built on scales suggesting enormous labor investment, and beneath them, repeatedly, the discovery of remains that challenge accepted human history. Workers from the 1800s described these findings in private correspondence. Skeletons positioned in seated arrangements. Burial chambers constructed with stone that required tremendous effort to transport. Grave goods suggesting sophisticated cultural practices, and invariably, skeletal dimensions that exceeded normal human proportions by factors that make no biological sense. Shortly after these discoveries across multiple states, something strange started happening. Reports were minimized, newspaper coverage decreased, academic institutions stopped acknowledging the findings, deep burial excavations were discouraged, and certain archaeological sites were restricted from further investigation. Some of this was officially designated as respect for Native American burial sites, a reasonable and ethical consideration. But the decisions about which sites to restrict and which findings to suppress raised quiet questions among researchers, because the discoveries that vanished most completely were invariably the ones that challenged the official timeline the most. The 18-foot skeletons, the elaborate burial constructions, the evidence of populations that preceded recognized Native American cultures. These findings were systematically removed from scientific discourse. Their physical evidence disappeared into institutional storage, their documentation minimized in academic publications, their existence quietly erased from the historical narrative. When you look at the final decades of the 19th century, the pattern becomes undeniable. Giant discoveries didn't stop because the remains stopped emerging. They stopped being reported. Not naturally, not gradually. The reporting stopped. The further the archaeological work progressed, the more the nature of public documentation changed. Early accounts were detailed, measurements were precise, and witness testimonies were recorded. But by the early 20th century, the language becomes dismissive, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if institutional authorities suddenly controlled what could be acknowledged. And this is where the real mystery begins, because the final giant discoveries documented in American newspapers weren't dismissed due to lack of evidence. They were dismissed despite overwhelming evidence. Multiple witnesses, physical remains, photographic documentation, all systematically excluded from the accepted historical record. Imagine what it would mean if the skeletal remains discovered across North America genuinely represented a population that preceded recognized human cultures. Imagine what it means if the burial mounds weren't constructed by the ancestors of modern Native American tribes, but by an earlier, substantially larger human population that American archaeology refuses to acknowledge. And maybe that's why the 1845 Tennessee giant was quietly erased, not to protect the remains, but to protect the narrative. The scattered newspaper accounts tell their own story. Workers standing beside bones that seem almost impossible, measurements that mirror similar discoveries across the continent, evidence too consistent for coincidence, yet too disturbing for mainstream acceptance. These aren't the kinds of findings historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to discuss at all. And that brings us to the final question. Why was the most extraordinary evidence, the most thoroughly documented discoveries, the most witnessed skeletal remains erased from history? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The 18-foot skeleton was disappeared. The newspaper documentation was minimized. The witness testimonies were dismissed. The museum acquisitions were hidden. The burial mound discoveries were suppressed. And even the institutional records that acknowledged these findings were systematically purged or restricted, almost as if those excavations across 19th-century America had accidentally revealed a chapter of human history that wasn't supposed to emerge. A chapter older than the Native American cultures we record, older than the migration theories we teach, older than the narrative we were given. And for a few decades in the 1800s, the earth opened just enough to reveal it. Hundreds of giant discoveries documented in newspapers, observed by thousands of witnesses, acknowledged by scientific institutions. But instead of studying it, they erased it, suppressed it, hid it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if North America was inhabited by a race of giants before the cultures we recognize, then the real question isn't what was discovered in Tennessee in 1845. It's what else remains beneath the burial mounds of the continent. What other skeletal evidence, what other physical proof, what other discoveries were quietly disappeared before independent documentation existed? The Tennessee giant wasn't just a frontier curiosity. It was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse into a version of human history we were never supposed to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your invitation to question everything we think we understand about who walked this continent before us. Because if an 18-foot skeleton could be discovered, displayed, documented, and then completely erased from history, imagine what else has been systematically removed from our past. Something impossible, something forbidden, something that changes everything.